the late 1930s, the tension in Europe was palpable. The continent was on edge, with powers testing boundaries and old treaties unraveling. Finland, a small nation bordering the Soviet Union, faced a precarious situation. The country was determined to maintain its independence, to avoid the horrors of war, yet aware that the geopolitical currents were shifting dangerously. President Kallio and his government understood the gravity of the situation. Diplomacy became the most crucial weapon Finland had. Kallio engaged in numerous negotiations, both in Helsinki and abroad, attempting to secure guarantees of safety and sovereignty. Behind closed doors, envoys met with Soviet representatives in Moscow, discussing border adjustments, security guarantees, and the possibility of peaceful resolutions. Every conversation carried immense weight. A single misstep could tip the fragile balance into war. The Finnish leadership was acutely aware of their military limitations. Finland had a professional army, but it was small compared to the vast Soviet forces. Strategic planning focused on defensive positions, the fortification of key areas, and ensuring that every soldier was prepared for the eventuality of conflict. Maps were drawn, units were positioned, and supply lines were meticulously organized. Yet all of this preparation was underpinned by a desperate hope that negotiations would succeed. Diplomatic missions became almost ritualistic. Delegations traveled repeatedly to Moscow, sometimes in harsh winter conditions, to sit across from Soviet officials whose demands shifted like the wind. Finland offered compromises, discussed territorial adjustments in sparsely populated areas, and suggested mutual security arrangements. The goal was always the same: peace without concession of essential sovereignty. Inside Finland, the government balanced preparation with reassurance. Citizens were anxious, aware of the looming threat, yet encouraged to trust in the nation's leadership. Schools, towns, and communities quietly prepared for emergencies, stockpiling supplies, organizing local defense groups, and ensuring that families could endure hardship if diplomacy failed. The Finnish psyche, shaped by centuries of border conflicts and resilience, held fast. Survival required both courage and prudence. Despite these efforts, the shadow of the Soviet Union loomed ever larger. Intelligence reports, border incidents, and military movements heightened the sense of urgency. Finland knew that war was not certain, but that its avoidance depended on careful negotiation, strategic foresight, and the steadfastness of its leaders. Every meeting in Moscow, every telegram exchanged, carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The nation's leaders faced impossible choices: yield too much, and Finland risked losing its independence; resist too firmly, and the Soviet Union could respond with overwhelming force. Each option was fraught with peril. The Finnish government worked tirelessly, crafting messages, consulting with military advisors, and coordinating with foreign diplomats to strengthen their position. Their objective was clear: maintain sovereignty while keeping the nation out of war. The months leading up to November 1939 were tense and calculated. Finland's diplomats returned from Moscow time and again with partial agreements, proposals, and assurances that were never fully satisfactory. The people, sensing the precariousness of the situation, prepared quietly but with resolve. The nation's spirit, honed by harsh winters and a long history of resisting foreign domination, infused every citizen with the same determination as their leaders. Finland would survive, whatever the cost. As the autumn of 1939 wore on, the diplomatic tightrope became increasingly fragile. Reports from the border hinted at Soviet military readiness. Messages from Moscow suggested both willingness and threat in equal measure. The Finnish leadership remained committed to avoiding war, aware that failure in diplomacy could lead to devastation, yet resolute in defending the country's independence. This period was not marked by the chaos of battle, but by the tension of anticipation, the careful chess of negotiation, and the unyielding resolve of a nation determined to survive. Every decision, every envoy, every conversation was a lifeline, a chance to prevent catastrophe. Finland's hope was that reason, prudence, and steadfast leadership could keep the shadow of war at bay. As October 1939 deepened, Finland's atmosphere was a mixture of cautious optimism and underlying dread. The crisp northern air carried a sense of foreboding, and every telegram from Moscow was scrutinized with meticulous attention. President Kallio and his ministers had long recognized that words alone would not secure peace. They depended on the careful choreography of diplomacy, shrewd negotiation, and the unwavering courage of a small nation standing at the edge of Europe's geopolitical storm. Repeatedly, Finnish envoys traveled to Moscow. Meetings were held in austere rooms with heavy curtains and the omnipresent sense that each conversation could determine the fate of the nation. Soviet representatives presented their demands: territorial adjustments, military bases, and strategic concessions along Finland's eastern borders. Each proposal was framed as a necessity for Soviet security, yet Finland's leadership understood that acceding to these demands could erode sovereignty irreparably. Back home, preparations continued quietly but systematically. Soldiers drilled on frozen grounds, rifles were inspected, and defensive positions along the Karelian Isthmus were carefully mapped. Towns and villages stockpiled food and firewood, knowing that winter could be both a friend and a foe. Finnish families understood that survival required discipline, endurance, and mutual support. Mothers taught children to conserve supplies, farmers tended to their livestock with precise care, and men and women alike shared stories of past hardships, drawing inspiration from the resilience of earlier generations. In the capital, Helsinki, tension was palpable yet disciplined. Government offices hummed with activity. Clerks and aides documented every telegram, every memo, every subtle nuance from the Soviet side. Cabinet meetings stretched long into the night as ministers debated every word, anticipating the consequences of every possible decision. The weight of responsibility was extraordinary. They were not merely negotiating with a foreign power, they were negotiating for the very survival of their nation. Despite these strains, a quiet determination pervaded the country. Finns understood that survival would require both courage and ingenuity. Forests became both sanctuary and training ground. Lakes and rivers offered natural obstacles that could be turned to strategic advantage. Local militias and volunteer units conducted exercises in secret, learning to move silently, fight from cover, and anticipate the movements of a much larger adversary. Every citizen was aware that Finland's small size demanded cleverness, speed, and unbroken willpower. By late October, intelligence suggested that Soviet forces were mobilizing. Reports from border patrols indicated increasing activity, trucks, trains, and troops moving eastward, while reconnaissance flights cast long shadows over forests and lakes. Finland's leaders absorbed these warnings with the same grim pragmatism that had guided them through earlier crises. Diplomacy remained the first and foremost option, but the nation was readying itself for the grim possibility that words might fail where guns could not. President Kallio, a man known for calm resolve and profound patriotism, addressed his ministers repeatedly. Finland's goal was peace, but not at the cost of freedom. Every discussion with Moscow was approached with this principle in mind: protect the country, defend its borders, and preserve its independence. To Kallio, diplomacy was not a passive tool. It was a weapon, wielded with precision, patience, and courage. In the towns and villages, life continued under this shadow of uncertainty. Schools remained open, but lessons often included preparedness, how to conserve resources, how to respond to emergencies, and how to protect families. Community centers doubled as meeting points for discussions on defense and survival. Everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, understood that Finland's very existence was at stake. Throughout October, the pattern of negotiation and preparation became almost ritualistic. Finnish envoys returned from Moscow with proposals that were cautiously promising, but ultimately unsatisfactory. Border adjustments were discussed, but Moscow's demands always seemed to expand. Finland countered with reasoned arguments, emphasizing historical treaties, population safety, and the delicate balance of peace. Yet each answer had to be measured. Each concession weighed against the potential loss of sovereignty. As the days shortened and snow threatened to cover the northern forests, the tension was mirrored in the hearts of all Finns. The country's survival depended on meticulous diplomacy, tireless preparation, and the collective will of a nation accustomed to hardship. The small size of Finland was no weakness. Rather, it demanded ingenuity, unity, and an unyielding commitment to freedom.
The stage was set. Winter's first frost coated the land, and with it came the chilling awareness that the choices of the coming days could determine Finland's destiny. Diplomacy remained the lifeline, but the threat of conflict was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. Every village, every town, every soldier, and every citizen knew that the decisions of Moscow and Helsinki would soon collide on the frozen terrain, shaping history forever. November 1939 dawned cold and clear across Finland, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the tension gripping the nation. Weeks of diplomacy had yielded little progress. Every meeting in Moscow seemed to expand the list of Soviet demands: territories along the Karelian Isthmus, military bases near Finnish cities, and assurances that effectively compromised Finland's independence. Yet the Finnish government, led by President Kallio and his advisors, refused to yield essential sovereignty. The streets of Helsinki were quiet, but the city pulsed with the weight of unseen preparation. Government offices were alive with urgent correspondence, every telegram analysed and every nuance debated. Cabinet meetings stretched late into the night, the glow of candlelight and desk lamps illuminating maps of forests, lakes, and strategic positions. Officers and advisors plotted defensive lines, calculated supply routes, and ensured that every soldier knew the role he might soon play. The fate of the nation balanced on these intricate plans and the fragile hope that diplomacy could hold. In the rural heartlands, the country's backbone, its people, prepared with methodical resolve. Farmers stored grain, chopped firewood, and tended livestock with the precision of those who knew that winter would not wait for war to begin. Villages organized local defense teams, men trained in forests, learning to move silently, strike swiftly, and disappear before overwhelming forces could respond. Even the children learned, through drills and instruction, the importance of vigilance, unity, and resilience. Every person, knowingly or not, was a participant in Finland's collective strategy to survive. Every day brought new intelligence of Soviet mobilization. Rail lines carried troops closer to the border. Convoys of vehicles rumbled through the forests, and aerial reconnaissance flights sketched the lines of impending confrontation. Finnish officers studied these movements carefully. Each shift of a train, each campfire in the wilderness, each sign of supply distribution was analysed for strategy and timing. Finland's leaders understood that war might not be avoidable, and preparation became both mental and physical, a shield as critical as any wall of stone or line of soldiers. President Kallio, stoic and resolute, met repeatedly with his ministers and military commanders. Every option was discussed, every possible concession weighed, Yet the message was clear. Finland would negotiate, but it would not surrender its sovereignty. Kallio believed in the power of reason, in the possibility of avoiding bloodshed through intelligence and diplomacy, yet he also recognized the necessity of readiness. Throughout the nation, communities waited in tense anticipation. Towns along the eastern borders observed every unusual movement, unfamiliar footprints in the snow, distant echoes of engines, and the subtle signs of military readiness. Farmers, traders, and children alike sensed the weight of history pressing down. Finland's population understood the gravity of the situation. This was not an abstract political conflict, but a tangible threat to life, land, and independence. Diplomatic channels were strained to their limits. Delegates returned from Moscow exhausted, carrying proposals that alternately promised security and threatened compromise. Finland's negotiators pressed back with reasoned arguments. Historical precedent, population safety, the principles of self-determination, and the dangers of provoking conflict. Each word mattered. Each pause, each hesitation, each careful phrase might influence whether a single spark could ignite a war that the country was desperate to avoid. As November deepened, the sense of urgency grew. The first snow had blanketed forests and fields, freezing rivers and lakes, creating both obstacles and opportunities. Finnish soldiers practiced movement across ice and snow, learning to use the landscape to their advantage. Every soldier knew that the terrain could be an ally if understood correctly, and the lessons of centuries of border conflicts guided their strategy. Despite Finland's meticulous diplomacy, the Soviet demands became increasingly uncompromising. Moscow insisted on concessions that Finland could not accept without surrendering its core independence. Tension escalated daily. Each missed agreement, each delayed response, increased the stakes. Finland's leaders and citizens alike realized that the line between negotiation and confrontation was razor thin. By mid-November, the nation braced itself. Defensive positions were finalized. Stockpiles were secured. Every village, every town, and every military unit understood that the next few days could change history irrevocably. Yet the Finnish spirit remained unbroken. Even under threat of overwhelming force, the nation's leaders and people carried hope, resilience, and the quiet confidence born of centuries of facing adversity. As the month wore on, it became increasingly evident that diplomacy alone might not prevent conflict. Finland had done everything possible to avert war. Careful negotiation, strategic compromises in minor areas, continuous engagement with Soviet officials, and preparation to defend the homeland if necessary. Yet the shadow of war loomed ever closer. The stage was now set for the inevitable confrontation. Winter's frost coated the land, the forests, and the lakes, and a nation prepared itself for the test of survival. The decisions of Moscow and Helsinki were about to collide with history. Finland had sought every opportunity for peace, but the cost of independence was about to be measured in courage, strategy, and unyielding resolve. By late November 1939, Finland stood at the brink. The negotiations in Moscow had ended in stalemate. Finnish envoys returned with messages that were firm in tone. The Soviet Union would not accept compromise. Moscow demanded strategic territories along the Karelian Isthmus, fortifications, and military control of key ports. Finland, bound by its desire to maintain sovereignty, rejected these demands outright. Diplomacy, the lifeline the nation had clung to for months, had run its course. The forests and lakes of eastern Finland, once silent and serene, now bore the marks of preparation. Soldiers dug defensive positions in the frozen earth. Trenches, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified posts were constructed in secrecy. Every officer, every volunteer, Every farmer turned militiaman understood the significance of each measurement, each placement of sandbags, each stockpile of ammunition. The land itself became both shield and battlefield. In Helsinki, President Kallio convened his cabinet for one of the final planning sessions. The gravity in the room was palpable. Maps were spread across tables, marked with units, defensive lines, and strategic locations. Advisors whispered details about troop movements, rail logistics, and border intelligence. Every decision was meticulous. Every delay could be catastrophic. Kallio addressed his ministers with calm resolve. We have done everything to avoid this war. Our nation's independence is non-negotiable. We stand prepared to defend it. Across the country, civilians felt the tension rising like a storm cloud. Farmers tended their winter crops with anxious hands. Families gathered extra firewood and provisions, knowing that the months ahead could be harsh. Children learned in hushed tones about safety measures, evacuation plans, and the importance of obedience. The nation's entire population became part of a quiet, invisible defense, embodying the Finnish determination that would later be called sisu. Border reports confirmed the looming threat. Soviet forces had mobilized along Finland's eastern frontier. Reconnaissance units observed convoys moving steadily toward the Karelian Isthmus. Airplanes flew reconnaissance missions, silhouetted against the pale winter sky. Each sighting was analyzed by Finnish intelligence, each movement logged and relayed to commanders. Finland's leaders knew the adversary's strength far exceeded their own, but the strategy relied on mobility, terrain, and resilience. The population, aware of the narrowing margin for peace, did not panic. Instead, there was a solemn, shared resolve. Town meetings, church gatherings, and local councils emphasized discipline and unity. The message was clear. The country might face a storm unlike any other, but it would stand firm. On November 26, 1939, the world watched silently as the situation reached its climax. Soviet artillery opened fire along the border, marking the first acts of aggression. Finnish border guards, stationed in forward posts and bunkers, returned fire when possible, but prioritized strategic retreat and intelligence gathering. Communication lines buzzed with urgent messages. The inevitability of conflict had arrived, and Finland's hopes to avoid war had come to an end. President Kallio addressed the nation. Though the words were formal, the emotion was unmistakable. Our patience has been tested. Our efforts for peace have been exhaustive. Today, we face the choice to defend our homeland, our families, and our freedom. Finland stands united. Across the country, from the cities to the remotest villages, people understood that the nation's independence would now be defended by courage, discipline, and unbroken resolve. Soldiers took positions along fortified lines. Units trained for months were now deployed, moving silently through forests, across frozen lakes, and along snow-covered roads. Every maneuver, every preparation, every sacrifice was guided by the knowledge that the nation's survival depended on determination as much as on weaponry. The land itself, with its dense forests, frozen rivers, and treacherous terrain, became a partner in the defense. The opening moments of the Winter War were not just a military engagement. They were the culmination of months of diplomacy, preparation, and hope. Finland had done everything to avoid the conflict, yet circumstances had forced the nation into battle. The story of these final days, of tireless negotiation, relentless preparation, and quiet courage, would forever mark the beginning of a legendary struggle for survival. As the first artillery rounds echoed across the Karelian Isthmus and snowfields, Finland faced the storm with resolve. The months of negotiation, the careful planning, the hope for peace, all had led to this moment. The nation, small in size but vast in spirit, was about to demonstrate that courage, unity, and determination could confront even the most overwhelming odds. The Winter War had begun. The first shots along the Karelian Isthmus resonated across the forests and frozen lakes, carrying the weight of a nation's struggle for survival. Finnish soldiers, many volunteers and reservists, were stationed along defensive positions meticulously prepared in the previous months. Every trench, bunker, and anti-tank obstacle now held significance beyond strategy. They represented the line between Finland's independence and subjugation. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Finnish forces relied on ingenuity, terrain knowledge, and endurance. Forests became natural fortresses. Lakes and rivers froze solid, offering both obstacles and tactical advantages. Small units moved swiftly along hidden paths, conducting reconnaissance and ambushes. Finnish commanders understood that mobility, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the land could counterbalance the Soviet numerical advantage. Early battles were tense and chaotic. Soviet troops, confident in their overwhelming numbers, advanced in mechanized columns and massed formations. Finnish defenders, however, utilized guerrilla tactics with precision. Snipers, patrols, and small ambush units harassed supply lines and slowed progress. The cold winter amplified every challenge. Frozen weapons, frost-bitten soldiers, and treacherous ice transformed the battlefield into an unforgiving environment. Yet for every Soviet advance, Finnish units responded with resilience and tactical cunning. Behind the front lines, the Finnish population mobilized. Villages near the eastern border became centers of support, with citizens providing supplies, transportation, and shelter. Women organized hospitals, cooked for troops, and maintained communication networks. Children learned to carry messages or assist in basic logistics. The war was total in scope, not only a battle of armies, but a collective defense of a nation's survival. Communication lines were lifelines. Finnish officers relayed information from scouts in the forests and from observation posts on hills and frozen lakes. Every report, from small troop movements to artillery positions, was critical in shaping defensive strategies. Commanders made rapid decisions, moving units to respond to threats while conserving strength for key battles. The nation's survival depended on coordination, quick thinking, and unwavering morale. The first weeks of the war tested Finland's courage to its limits. Outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a relentless adversary, Finnish troops endured freezing temperatures, shortages of ammunition, and relentless pressure. Yet their resolve never wavered. The winter landscape, which could have been an enemy, became an ally. Deep snow slowed Soviet tanks, dense forests concealed Finnish movements, and frozen rivers created barriers that protected defensive lines. The most legendary among Finnish forces began to make their mark. Snipers, scouts, and small units executed maneuvers that would be remembered for decades. Every success, every delayed advance by Soviet troops became a symbol of determination and the concept of sisu, the Finnish blend of courage, perseverance, and endurance. Stories of these early actions traveled quickly among soldiers and civilians, bolstering morale and reinforcing the belief that Finland could survive against all odds. Despite victories in small engagements, the situation remained critical. Soviet artillery bombardments increased, and winter storms compounded the difficulties for Finnish defenders. Communication errors, exhaustion, and the vast scale of the front tested the nation's preparedness. Yet the defensive lines held, not because of raw power, but because of discipline, strategy, and the unbroken will of those fighting to protect their homeland.
President Kallio and the government monitored developments with grim determination. Every report from the front was scrutinized, and every civilian concern addressed. Finland's leadership knew that morale at home was as crucial as effectiveness at the front. Families were briefed on evacuation routes, towns organized shelters, and communities came together to maintain order amid the chaos. The first fortnight of the Winter War demonstrated a painful truth. Finland could not avoid conflict, but it could survive it. Through discipline, preparation, ingenuity, and unwavering courage, the nation resisted a far larger adversary. Each engagement, each ambush, each small victory reinforced the Finnish belief that independence was worth any sacrifice. As November turned to December, the snow deepened, and the war hardened the land and the people. The Karelian Isthmus became the epicenter of resistance, a frozen theater where strategy, terrain, and the human spirit collided. Finland's small army, moving like shadows among the trees, showed the world that numbers alone did not guarantee victory. The coming months would test endurance, courage, and the very identity of a nation determined to remain free. As December 1939 unfolded, the Finnish winter deepened, blanketing forests, lakes, and villages in thick snow. The harsh environment became both a weapon and a challenge. Along the eastern border, Finnish soldiers entrenched themselves with unwavering resolve. The enemy, the enormous Soviet forces, advanced with mechanized confidence, yet Finland's defenders relied on a strategy born of intimate knowledge of the land, meticulous preparation, and the extraordinary courage of a small nation determined to survive. The Karelian Isthmus and northern sectors, including Suomussalmi and Kollaa, became the crucibles of Finland's resistance. In these frozen battlefields, the disparity in numbers between Finnish and Soviet forces was staggering. Yet the Finnish army, often composed of reservists and volunteers, used terrain to their advantage. Snow-covered forests allowed for ambushes, frozen rivers delayed armored units, and small, mobile detachments disrupted supply lines, forcing the enemy to advance cautiously. Kollaa, in particular, became legendary. Finnish soldiers, though outnumbered and outgunned, held the line against relentless Soviet assaults. It was here that the simple yet profound phrase, "Kollaa will hold, Kollaa holds," became a rallying cry, symbolizing the nation's unbroken spirit. Every soldier, from the youngest volunteer to the hardened officer, understood that retreat was not an option. Trench by trench, meter by meter, they defended the frontier against forces far superior in size and firepower. In Suomussalmi, a different kind of battle unfolded. Finnish units, employing guerrilla tactics and ski mobility, encircled and disrupted Soviet columns. Artillery positions were targeted, convoys ambushed, and supply routes cut. These actions demonstrated that strategy, terrain mastery, and courage could offset overwhelming odds. Finnish snipers, famously including Simo Häyhä, nicknamed the White Death, executed precise and deadly operations, inflicting fear and chaos among Soviet troops. Häyhä's silent, lethal precision in sub-zero conditions became a symbol of Finnish ingenuity and determination. Every engagement, every successful ambush, every delayed enemy advance reinforced national morale. Soldiers communicated through simple signals, learned from generations of forestry and hunting, and leveraged natural cover with unmatched skill. Even when isolated, Finnish units displayed extraordinary discipline, improvisation, and endurance. Their actions slowed Soviet advances, buying crucial time for reinforcement and civilian protection. Behind the lines, Finland's population rallied.
civilians provided vital support, transporting supplies, assisting in fortifications, and maintaining communication networks. Local knowledge of terrain, roads, and forests was invaluable. Women, children, and the elderly all played roles in sustaining the war effort. The defense of Finland became a collective endeavor, uniting every citizen in a shared struggle for survival. The first months of the Winter War illustrated a stark contrast between brute force and strategic cunning. Soviet forces, confident in their overwhelming numbers, struggled against the Finnish defensive system. Finnish ingenuity, leveraging snow, forests, and knowledge of the land, turned the environment itself into an ally. Ski troops moved silently, snipers struck with precision, and small units executed ambushes that inflicted disproportionate damage on the advancing enemy. Kollaa held, and Suomussalmi became a testament to the effectiveness of small unit tactics against a larger force. Reports of Finnish successes traveled quickly, inspiring hope across the nation. Even in the coldest, most dangerous conditions, Finland's defenders showed that courage.
Political leaders in Helsinki, including President Kallio, monitored developments with grim attention. Every skirmish, every frontline report, and every civilian situation informed strategy and communication. The nation's leadership understood that sustaining morale at home was as critical as success on the battlefield. Regular broadcasts, local meetings, and public addresses emphasized resilience, unity, and the shared responsibility of defending the homeland. Despite the courage and skill displayed by Finnish forces, the war remained brutal. Soviet artillery barrages flattened positions, and overwhelming numbers pressed Finnish lines relentlessly. Yet the defenders adapted, constructing secondary fortifications, executing counterattacks, and using mobility to offset the enemy's advantage. The lessons learned in the first weeks became crucial for survival, shaping tactics and inspiring creativity on every front. The international community watched with growing admiration. Reports of Finnish bravery, ingenuity, and the defiance of overwhelming odds spread worldwide. Volunteers from other nations, inspired by Finland's stand, traveled north to assist in limited capacities, while governments debated sanctions and support for the beleaguered nation. Though Finland stood largely alone, its reputation as a nation of unbreakable resolve spread far beyond its borders. By late January, the Winter War had established a narrative that would endure in history. A small nation, surrounded by a massive adversary, relied on courage, intelligence, and unity to resist domination. Every hold of Kollaa, every maneuver in Suomussalmi, and every small victory in the frozen forests demonstrated that determination, skill, and strategy could achieve what brute force alone could not. The Finnish people, from soldiers to civilians, were engaged in a struggle that transcended ordinary warfare. It was a battle for survival, sovereignty, and identity. Every day, every defensive position, every ambush, and every act of ingenuity reinforced the truth that Finland, though small in size, possessed a spirit and resilience unmatched by any numerical advantage. The legend of these battles, Kollaa holding firm, Suomussalmi encircling the enemy, Simo Häyhä's deadly precision, would become symbols not only of military genius, but of national character. Finland had entered the Winter War reluctantly, having sought every opportunity to avoid it. Yet the nation's courage in the face of overwhelming odds would ensure that its story endured long after the snow melted and the war's guns fell silent. February 1940 arrived with an icy grip, covering forests, lakes, and villages in deep snow. For months, Finland had withstood relentless assaults, defying expectations and shocking the world with the courage of its people. Yet the strain was immense. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, frostbite, exhaustion,
and the constant pressure of an enemy far larger than themselves. Civilians continued to sustain the war effort, their resilience intertwined with that of the troops defending the homeland. On the Karelian Isthmus, battles raged with extraordinary intensity. Soviet forces, frustrated by repeated setbacks, launched large-scale attacks. Finnish defenders, though heavily outnumbered, relied on meticulously prepared positions, knowledge of the terrain, and the unbreakable determination that had carried them through the first months of the war. Trenches were reinforced, artillery repositioned, and small units executed daring counterattacks to disrupt enemy advances. In the north, at Suomussalmi and surrounding forests, Finnish ski troops continued their legendary operations. Soviet columns, attempting to advance through dense forests, found themselves surrounded, ambushed, and delayed. These actions, though small in scale compared to the vast numbers of the enemy, had an enormous strategic impact. Supplies were disrupted, reinforcements delayed, and morale shattered. The ingenuity and skill of Finnish forces amplified the effect of every maneuver, proving once again that courage, planning, and knowledge of the land could turn the tide against overwhelming odds. The heroics of individuals became national legend. Simo Häyhä, operating in near-total white camouflage, continued to eliminate key targets with lethal precision, earning the enduring nickname, the White Death. Stories of soldiers defending isolated positions for days, ski troops carrying out daring raids, and villagers maintaining the lifelines of food, ammunition, and communication spread rapidly. These tales were not merely reports, they were symbols of national identity, resilience, and sisu, the spirit that had carried Finland through centuries of hardship.
Back in Helsinki, President Kallio and the government monitored the front lines with relentless attention. Decisions were made with precision, balancing the need for defense, civilian safety, and strategic advantage. The nation's leadership understood that every action, every dispatch, and every logistical decision could influence the outcome of battles far from the capital. Radio communications relayed encouragement and guidance, reinforcing the shared determination of soldiers and civilians alike. Despite heroic defenses, the reality of Finland's position remained stark. Soviet forces were immense, well-equipped, and relentless. Yet every day that Finland held, every kilometer of frozen forest defended, and every ambush executed, demonstrated that the nation's courage and ingenuity could delay and disrupt a vastly superior enemy. The story of survival became a testament to the power of strategy, resilience, and national unity. By mid-February, exhaustion weighed heavily on both soldiers and civilians. Yet even in this extreme adversity, the Finnish spirit never faltered. Troops manned their positions with unwavering resolve, communities sustained supply lines, and families found ways to endure the relentless winter. The nation's survival depended on endurance as much as strategy, courage as much as planning. Finally, diplomatic negotiations and the realities of war brought the conflict to an uneasy conclusion. The Moscow Peace Treaty was signed on March 12, 1940. Finland had resisted the overwhelming forces of the Soviet Union, inflicted heavy losses, and preserved its independence, though it ceded territory along the Karelian Isthmus. The treaty marked the end of active combat, but the story of courage, resilience, and national unity endured far beyond the frozen battlefields. The Winter War's legacy became a defining moment in Finnish history. The small nation had faced an enormous adversary and, through strategy, terrain mastery, and extraordinary courage, had survived against the odds. Tales of Kollaa holding firm, ski troops in Suomussalmi, and the precision of snipers like Simo Häyhä became immortalized in the national consciousness. Finland had entered the war reluctantly,
after exhausting every opportunity to avoid conflict. Yet it emerged with its spirit unbroken, its people proud, and its independence preserved. The cinematic truth of this story lies not only in battles and strategy, but in the unity of a nation. Soldiers and civilians, young and old, rural and urban, stood together in a struggle that tested endurance, courage, and ingenuity. Every act of bravery, every clever maneuver, every sacrifice contributed to the survival of a nation that refused to surrender. And so, as the snow melted and the long, brutal winter receded, Finland's story of the Winter War came to a close, not with defeat, but with a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring will of a small nation to remain free. The phrase, "Kollaa will hold," was no longer just a battle cry. It was the embodiment of a nation's soul, the echo of sisu, and the eternal reminder that freedom is defended not only with weapons, but with unyielding spirit.